Good morning, distinguished panelists, distinguished members of Mercy community, and welcome guests. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michiko Kuroda. I'm a visiting fellow to the Center on UN Affairs, and to thank you for coming to the International Week. This is, sorry, I want to admit, this is day 3 of our International Week. Happy Philosophy Day. And so today the world is celebrating this World Philosophy Day in many parts of the world. Mercy College is celebrating this in a special way by having a panel discussion on the topic of philosophy in the time of COVID-19. Are you ready? So now let us begin. I would like to introduce you today's moderator, Dr. Benjamin Abelson. Dr. Benjamin Abelson is Mercy's full-time professor of philosophy. Let's welcome Dr. Ben Abelson.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. We have a great panel today, including Dr. Saul Fisher, who, besides wearing many hats in Mercy's provost office, is also teaches a variety of courses in philosophy and related disciplines here at Mercy. We have Claudia Pace, who is a doctoral candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center and works on issues about empathy and morality, coming to us from Brampton, Ontario, Canada.
Thank you.
And we have Dr. Elisabetta Sergiovanni from Sapienza University of Rome, professor of philosophy, neuroethics, and bioethics. So it's truly a World Philosophy Day today here in this panel. So let's get started right away with Dr. Fisher. Saul, take it away.
Not great if I mute myself. So I guess, Michiko, you'll be letting folks in as I'll...
And everyone, feel free to ask questions in the chat. For now, we're not sure how much time we'll have for Q&A, but if you ask questions, maybe we'll try to respond to them live as much as possible.
Right. Okay, so I've shared my screen. I'm going to get this. All right, is it full screen? Not yet. Now it is, okay. All set? That's working? Okay, great. So I'm gonna talk a little bit today. I have what, 10 minutes, let's say?
More or less, yeah.
More or less. Okay, so I'll speed through this. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about utilitarian arguments that have been offered against the COVID-19 lockdowns. And yeah, so in the current COVID-19 pandemic environment, a number of pressing moral issues present themselves, including quandaries about fair and just distribution of scarce medical resources, the propriety and warrant for mass public health surveillance and data collection on as much of the world's population as possible, and justification for crippling restrictions on the economy to crush, as we now say, the curve. I focus on this last problem, which refers to many different restrictive regimes that I will simplify as most restrictive, the lockdown scenario. Just take the ultimate case here. The typical justification for lockdowns in this pandemic era is that they help to reduce the rate of viral transmission, plausibly to zero, by taking away the possibility of vectors of transmission. The typical argument against lockdowns is that these restrictions incur great economic and social cost, which outweighs the health gain from reducing the rate of viral transmission. The starting point in philosophical ethics for both the pro and the contra lines of reasoning is a utilitarian perspective, which tends to be a primary driver in the ethics of public health, though there are dissenting modes of reasoning, of course. The way that two or more utilitarians adjudicate a moral issue almost always involves presenting contrasting calculations, and that invariably involves a fight over what constitutes the right sorts of calculations. It's never a simple question of my tabulations versus yours. What I propose is that utilitarian arguments against COVID-19 lockdowns introduce critical considerations for debating the greatest restrictions, but ultimately neglect to include some of the right sorts of calculations. If you're a utilitarian then, and I'll be neutral on that matter, you should not be arguing against lockdowns, I maintain. Okay, so I'll start, just with an extraordinarily brief overview for those who need a refresher on the nature of utilitarianism. And then I'll say a little bit as well about the ethics of public health from a utilitarian perspective. Okay, so that's my outline, but I won't quite read it. All right, so here's the drill, as they say. The basic idea is that utilitarianism combines two ideas, more or less, that we should act to promote the greatest pleasure, and that the idea that the greatest pleasure consists in the greatest good for the greatest number. Fine. So the pictures that we rate actions as more or less morally correct in accordance with their relative utility, that is, their relative contribution to the achievement of the greatest good for the greatest number. Great. So, well, I have a little example, but perhaps that's not necessary. Right. Yeah. So, but the question here is which actions have better effects than others? If we want to gauge the greatest good for the greatest number of people, we can measure either the quantity or the quality of benefits achieved, and we'll likely take both into account. I'm not going to argue the merits of utilitarianism overall or worry about its flaws. Both are compelling in their ways, but I'm simply going to assume, for the sake of argument, that some form of utilitarian moral theory, there are many such forms, the general view is correct. For reasons I'll note in a moment, this turns out to be a felicitous way to think about public health issues such as pandemics present. But first I highlight two features of the view to which I've alluded, or maybe not, but in any case should be made more explicit. First, that utilitarianism usually suggests a fair, so to speak, distribution of goods and services in a world of scarcity is morally justifiable, if not morally required. Second, utilitarianism provides a universal moral standard that everybody, and even a computing device, could use to calculate exactly which actions are right and wrong given the right sorts of data. At a minimum, and this is what I'm calling the minimal model of utilitarian calculations, for each moral choice, we take the projected range of possible outcomes, assign each of the outcomes some standardized utility value based on populations affected and the utilities gained, and multiply that value times the relative probability of said outcomes. The greatest product gives us the moral path we are warranted in pursuing, right? And lots of folks think that that's a great thing about utilitarianism, precisely because it gives us something like a moral algorithm of sorts. Okay, so let me say a word about public health and utilitarianism. So we've got these various features in place. Perhaps now it's clear why utilitarianism is the moral theory that often has the greatest traction in considerations of public health. After all, a central concern of public health is the sort of allocation problem that we've seen relative to, say, ventilators or, say, PPE masks and such. How should we decide on equitable or fair or just distribution of scarce public health resources, again, such as tests, masks, vaccines? Or if we assume on some scenario that there is no just distribution, that is, that some will die simply because of brute scarcity, we need to be able to gauge the least unjust distribution. Other utilitarian considerations befitting public health ethics include gauging utility gains and losses of mandatory mass medicine, such as immunization, sterilization, and such, state coercion to protect society from immediate harm, and so on. A bit more generally, what we're looking for in public health ethics are ethical ground rules to guide public health interventions that we take to be morally viable. And this is where what you see on your screen here, the medical ethicist Jim Childress outlined a whole set of criteria to gauge the warrant for public health interventions. I won't go through all of them. I really just want to highlight three, numbers 2, Roman numerals 2, 3, and 4, that the benefits of an intervention outweigh costs of violating any moral principle. sort of proportionality kind of principle, that there's no substituted intervention which doesn't generate a side effect problem, that indeed this turns out to be the necessary intervention among any possible alternatives, and that the costs be the least among of that particular alternative of all alternatives, that is, say, the least infringement is incurred. Okay, so the Childress criteria, in keeping with his general approach to medical ethics, which is kind of pluralist approach, are intended to be independent of any particular moral theory. So it's supposed to work well with a Kantian alternative or a virtue ethics alternative. In any case, this means that we can fold such criteria into utilitarian calculations. Doing so here helps illuminate what's driving the utilitarian anti-lockdown perspective. And so I'll get to that just now. Okay, so the general utilitarian perspective on lockdowns engages two typical families of social benefits measures, right? One, the health benefits of lockdowns as promoting the common good through suppression of the pandemic by reducing or eliminating vectors. And two, on the other hand, the social or economic costs of lockdowns as promoting drastic economic downturn, inclusive of business closures, unemployment, and loss of gender gains in the workplace and the labor market. As well as in totally other category of negatives, pushing down most social class strata one or more levels. So, for example, the middle class become the poor and like that, and at other gradations. And a third negative is knock-on health losses, right, that concentrate the viral burden in disadvantaged communities that are working in the service sector. And as well, a fourth negative, exacerbation of depression, isolation, stress, and concomitant heart disease. Okay, so real health concerns, both mental and physical. Now, one might think, as health is always our first priority, necessary for any other utility to be produced or experienced, there's a clear ranking for utilitarians according to which the health benefits of lockdowns point to a morally winning strategy. However, as the well-known, really the best-known utilitarian theorist in a certain way, Peter Singer, together with Michael Plant, have recently suggested there's an inevitable trade-off between saving lives and saving livelihoods, right? Accordingly, looking at lockdowns from a utilitarian perspective does not show an obvious utility advantage. Moreover, they see a couple of other difficulties in terms of making fair and rational utilitarian calculations. I'll skip over those in the interest of time. At the end of the story, what they say is, look, we can have, in terms of gauging utility, we're looking for a common denominator, and the common denominator is going to be quality adjusted life years, which is kind of a big deal in economics and utilitarian thought, particularly as regards medical ethics, right? So what we're looking for here is the amount of time that people live that's in some sense typically health-wise, but otherwise as well, worth living, okay? So on the basis of such considerations, and because we don't even know that lockdowns work, right? There's some skepticism about that as well, at least in terms of completely crushing the curve. Singer and Plant suggest that we have to consider the possibility that lockdowns should be avoided. Here, Singer and Plant, as well as a number of other dissenting medical ethicists, philosophers of science, epidemiologists, are at least implicitly appealing to Childress's criteria, again, back here, of proportionality, necessity, and least infringement. Oh, I guess I have that down at the bottom of the slide. Okay, so in short, lockdowns should be really, truly worthwhile in terms of clear health benefits in ways for which there are no plausible substitutes, right? And which produce positive cost-benefit ratios and the least costly knock-on effects, right? That's the Childress criteria that are pertinent here. Now, utilitarian calculations that introduce those considerations, the lockdown dissenters say, show that lockdowns are just too costly and they fare worse than plausible alternative strategies for managing the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not just that we don't need to lock down 4 to 6 billion people for months or more. It's that doing so wreaks great havoc on the lives of many, pushing them past the point of economic viability. Okay, I'll cut to the chase just in this last I'll cut off a section here in the interest of time. Okay, so straight away, I think we have to concede the trade-offs picture that Singer, Plant, and others have pointed to. Yet I think the utilitarian calculations are subject to at least one more twist, right? One more important way of counting the relative utilities of the yes and no lockdown scenarios. It's helpful at this stage to turn to another dimension of public health reasoning, as elsewhere in practical reasoning, namely the calculation of risk. And here I focus on epidemiology. So a central goal of epidemiology is to find the probable causes of communicable disease among populations by identifying the most likely risk factors, okay? Engaging what the best treatments are accordingly. The assessment of risk as a guide to further action then is a major part of the enterprise. On the traditional model, right, so the traditional model of risk assessment, there's likely a weighing of costs versus benefits, or effectiveness, costs versus effectiveness, or costs versus efficiencies. Those are all three standard ratios of all relevant possible interventions, as well as doing nothing, right? So the best ratio wins, and a therapeutic recommendation and policy decision is made accordingly. This is the approach that Singer and Plant, along with other lockdown dissenters, have been taking, as incorporates these sort of Childress style considerations. Now, a somewhat newer approach, right, gestating, as it were, in the 1970s, which has particular currency in both public health spheres and environmental policy spheres, other spheres as well, has it that we follow something called the precautionary principle. Right? What's that? I've got it on your screen here. Even if we lack the firmest scientific evidence for establishing high risk, if there exists the possibility of both irremediable and irreversible disastrous consequences, we must act so as to avoid that possibility. The classic example here is let's not have nuclear plants, because even though there's only a small chance of something going awry, if it really goes awry, it's irremediable and irreversible and disastrous, right? So that sort of changes the probabilistic, doesn't change the probabilistic calculus, it changes the utilitarian calculations of the relevant probabilities. Right? In short, the burden of proof lies on those who would take the possibly irremediable and irreversible action to establish that it entails no such risk or negligibly so, just as in that cute little cartoon with the frogs not understanding the fate that awaits them. Okay, so consider this application to, I'm just trying to be careful on time here. Consider this application to the COVID-19 pandemic situation, right? So we've got this highly dangerous strain of coronavirus. It's rampant around the world. It shows no persistent signs of slowing down. And the second and third waves may yet be more dangerous and fatality producing than the first. From the earliest evidence, we've had good reason to see this coronavirus as high risk for causing massive losses in productivity and sidelining large numbers of healthy adults for weeks or months, in addition to causing fatalities in the millions. And I checked last night, our fatality numbers in the world today are 1.3 million. Until we have reached enough of the population with an effective vaccine, we face ongoing risk of the COVID-19 virus continuing to rampage. I've got about a minute or so left. The one known way of reducing or eliminating vectors is through lockdowns, but those have the aforementioned bad side effects, producing trade-offs that, on a traditional concept of risk calculation, might militate against lockdowns as less than optimal utility. However, given what we know to date about the virus's asymptomatic transmission and threatening exponential growth, as well as the ever-present possibility of mutation in the direction of even greater deadliness, right? There's a non-zero chance that the virus could wreak devastating damage on the world's medical infrastructure by overwhelming it with COVID-19 cases, producing not only mass fatalities, but as well dooming those who need critical medical attention for any other reason. We've had something of a taste of this right here in New York City back in the spring, right? But the situation could replicate around the world and at significantly higher rates of stress on the system to the point of breakdown. This in turn could have a great negative effect on the capacity to effectively and safely distribute vaccine, after all, then prolonging the viral rampage. Millions more would die as a result, and tens of millions might be long-term sufferers. Economies around the world might be shattered by a crippled workforce. In turn, starvation and yet worse disease could result. Civilization itself might well be threatened. Now, virologists and epidemiologists have warned that some incredibly bad virus could have such effects. So it merits our asking if this is at all a likely scenario with COVID-19. Probably not. Probably not, in the sense that it relies on the virus being at least slightly more deadly than it is in its present form. And that's a non-zero, but not high probability event. And if such mutation doesn't make COVID-19 significantly more deadly, then human civilization seems likely to be safe for the time being. Still, taking precautionary principle into account, we have to look at that non-zero probability event, gauge the irremediable and irreversible effects that might result, and factor that into our overall utility calculations. If lockdown blocks that possible nightmare scenario altogether, then all things considered, it has higher utility than the non-lockdown scenarios. But this greater utility is not brute. It's viewed as against the alternatives through the additional factor supplied by the precautionary principle. All right, I'll just sum up, and then that's that. In sum, if we gauge that risks are non-zero or greater than negligible relative to COVID-19, having irremediable and irreversible disastrous consequences, then we should act to avoid, so as to avoid that possibility, and our calculation of lockdowns as means of avoiding that possibility rises as a result. I'll simply stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Saul. Very interesting. All right, Claudia, you're up next.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to talk about, I don't have any anything to show you on screen other than myself. So I'm just gonna be talking at you for a while. So the thing that I want to talk about today, my name is Claudia Pace, by the way. I'd like to give a short presentation on how certain misunderstandings in philosophy and ethics and Darwinism can affect people's willingness to participate in COVID mitigation. And what I mean by COVID mitigation is stuff like participating in not possibly entire shutdowns and lockdowns, but more things like wearing a mask, or perhaps more generally just opting to stay home rather than going out. I mean, the more severe things would be things like choosing not to open a business or participate in a job that might spread COVID. For let's say you're a restaurant owner, it might be you might have the option of keeping your restaurant open and indoors, depending on the circumstance or the state or the place in the world that you're in. And so you have a question to ask of yourself. Should I participate in this sort of COVID mitigation if it seems like it's likely to hurt me in the short term? Especially in places not as much like Canada, but perhaps places more like the United States, where the government hasn't provided much income support. So going out and working and perhaps risking oneself and others may be just one factor in things like eating or paying one's rent, staying in housing, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, why should I participate in COVID mitigation tactics if they potentially hurt me? And so the thing that I want to point out first is there are two sort of ideas about participation and interactions with others floating around that are often misunderstood. And what I want to say is that often a misunderstanding of these two very closely related concepts are the sorts of things that may encourage someone to reason that it is in fact better for them to not participate in COVID mitigation. So the first concept is very classic survival of the fittest. This idea that that competition for survival in life is a competition between individual versus individual, and that it is usually the most ruthless or the strongest or the most selfish individual who tends to be the most successful. This goes together with this idea that living life in groups is like a zero-sum game. Instead of explaining it thoroughly, I'll just use the example of apples. So let's say you are living in a relatively free society where there are free apples available. It might be the case that you consider it, a loss to your personal fitness or your personal well-being, your personal potential future if the neighbor picks up an apple instead of you. right? The neighbor, anyone else's success is your loss, because it's just a basic battle for resources, individual versus individual. If they get an apple, they can give it to their family and their kids. That's one less apple for me to give to me, my family and my kids, and to actually benefit myself. So this sort of concept can be applied to the pandemic in a couple of ways. Number one, just the very basic brute sort of survival of the fittest. Why should I help other people? Actually, two things. Number one, the more brute one is why should we care about these people, in the sense that they're holding society back? You know, if there's a person who needs who has pre-existing conditions, why should I as an individual care about them? It's survival of the fittest. We should just let the weak die, and society will be better for it. And then there's this other sense that I just quickly alluded to, this idea that if I help them, I'm kind of hurting myself in a way. You know, why would I want the neighbor to get the apple? Why would I want the neighbor to do well? That's an apple that I could be taking. So that's one idea that if you read in the media, or unfortunately on Facebook, that's one idea that some people may have about reasoning why they ought not to participate in COVID mitigation tactics. And the other idea is this idea that comes a lot from economics, and often these things called prisoner's dilemma games, which I'm not going to show you any diagram because I'd like to keep the numbers out of it, at least for a very short presentation. But the idea is that some people think that cheating is always advantageous, regardless of the sort of circumstance that you're in, that it's always better. It's always better for you to get yours, regardless of what is good for the group. That's what I mean by cheating being advantageous. So in the classic prisoner's dilemma game, the idea is something like you and a co-conspirator are captured, and you actually figure out, you can mathematically figure out that by ratting out your co-conspirator, you actually do better. You get less jail time, regardless of what your co-conspirator does. And so if you use that sort of decision-making matrix, you and people are often tempted to say, well, cheating is always the right thing to do. It's never good for you to give up your advantage for other people. It is mathematically modeled, in this particular kind of game, that it is that it's disadvantageous for a person to do anything other than cheat. To use a different sort of example, one that's less numbers based, one that's sometimes used in evolutionary talk, I'll call it the group soup example. So imagine you and a member of a society, and you decide that you all have an arrangement that at the end of the day, any food that you gather goes into a giant pot, almost like a medieval perpetual stew. We call it the group soup. And it makes it so that no one is ever hungry if you have a bad day. Right. So if you don't end up catching a rabbit, you can always go to the group soup. But the thing is, if you have a really good day, all your stuff goes to the group soup. So it kind of levels everything out for you. It levels things out for everyone. So one might be tempted to think in this sort of circumstance, well, listen, why, if no one's really watching me, why should I contribute to the group soup? Right. If everyone else is doing it. So think of it in both ways. If everyone else is doing it, and I don't do it, I get double advantage. I get access to the group soup, and I get my own stash of meat on the side. If other people don't contribute to the group soup, I'm not going to do it. Why would I contribute my meat to a system that's not really going to fairly benefit me? If my neighbor is going to keep his meat aside and not put in the group soup and lie about it, I'm going to do so too. And we can bring that sort of thinking back to the pandemic. If people are going to stay home, then I don't really have to worry much about a pandemic. So if everyone's doing the right thing, if everyone's participating in group mitigation, there's less of a pressure for me to actually participate in group mitigation. And on the other hand, if no one's doing it, then why would I hurt myself in relation to these other people? If everyone else's restaurants are open, if everyone is in a bar, if you're like me and you're driving around Brampton, you think, oh, I really wish I could go to a pub. And then you turn your head and there's a pub open and it's full of people. And then you think to yourself, well, why shouldn't I go to the pub, right? Why should I do what people are telling me seems to be the right thing for the group? Okay, so that's the sort of position that we're in. And so the problems that these sorts of things one of the major issues that this brings up, or misunderstandings that this brings up, is that everything is me versus my neighbor. You know, again, this idea that if something good happens to my neighbor, it's going to be bad for me. And so this actually, there are quite a few problems with this issue, not this issue, with this this understanding of motivation and why we ought to do certain things during the pandemic when you see it through these two lenses. Because quite frankly, there are a lot of errors when it comes to looking at these models and applying them to the pandemic. The first is that it seems like in the group soup model, the cheating model, it seems like we're misassessing the value of cheating. It seems like we are totally miscounting any sort of potential damage that we can do to ourselves from cheating. You know, in the group soup example, we could lose access to the group soup altogether. People could stop trusting us altogether. It's not merely short-term game, excuse me. It's a longer-term game. I mean, unless you're nomadic and you decide to only interact with individuals in individual iterations, people are going to know that you're a cheater. But the other thing about the pandemic is that there is a genuine risk of illness, right? Other than just, being scoffed at for not wearing a mask, there's the genuine risk of illness, not only for you, but for other people. Again, we know from models that are done that even small mitigation tactics can help if they're theoretically at the bottlenecks of bigger lines of transmission. So one person staying home could stop 10,000 people from being infected in 2 months from now. So there's that issue. So it seems like, and in a lot of people tend to make those mistakes in general. People tend to make the mistake of thinking that all interactions are these sorts of interactions where cheating is always advantageous, and there's no disadvantage to cheating. And again, in a pandemic, the disadvantage to cheating, or one of the major obvious ones, is a potential risk to one's health. Okay? Then we have this idea of cheating affecting your long-term benefits. It goes back to this idea of participation and just living in a society where people will know that you are a cheater. Right. So it may be the case that people don't want to do business with you. They don't want to go to your restaurant in the future after the pandemic is closed because they think you're responsible for keeping it roaring because you had your restaurant open the whole time. That's one. But the other major issue that seems to be the heart of what a lot of this is that people tend to think that the neighbor's gain is your loss, without understanding how important group cohesion is and group health and sharing ideas and cooperation is in a person's survival. So let's say you are, you have a neighbor and you see your neighbor get an apple. A person might think, that the apple could be my child's. But if your neighbor is like an ICU nurse or a doctor or a researcher, you don't want to be the only person surviving, right? In a society where we exchange ideas, where we are interdependent on one another for things like basic resources, healthcare. It doesn't always matter that you're the strongest person in a weak society or in a society that is not very cohesive. So imagine you are the most successful restaurant owner in North Dakota right now. That might be nice theoretically, but who's going to come to your restaurant if there's a raging pandemic around you? Who are you going to do business with? It's much more likely that that your way of life is going to be jeopardized in that way. So people tend to, the gist of what I'm trying to say is that people just tend to misunderstand these sorts of evolutionary and cooperative and these economic games to reason that it is always best for them to do what's best for themselves, both individually and to deviate from the group. And that especially in times of pandemics, it seems like we forget this important thing that groups matter, cohesion matters, societies matter, and that success is not just survival of the fittest individual, it's the success of an individual in a moderately successful group or society. So that is my talk for today.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you.
Very cool stuff. Great. So we're now moving on to Elizabeth.
Yes. Hi. I don't hear you anymore. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, so I'm sharing my screen, okay? So I'm going, well, thanks the organizers and thanks Ben for inviting me. I'm connecting from Rome. So I'm going to speak about disgust, morality, and the pandemic. So I'll start with this. This is the Pope sandwich. So how would you react if I asked you to eat it? So in 2009, some Australian researchers primed a group of people to increase hand hygiene frequency by showing images like that. So my intent today is to frame the research about disgust and moral behavior, basically more than moral judgment, in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? So research on disgust and moral behavior judgment has been very relevant in moral psychology and neuroscience of the last decades. And it has stimulated influential philosophical debates. Albeit being considered a basic emotion, disgust is anything but a simplistic state, but rather we can say a generator of philosophical contradictions. So let me focus on two findings coming from this disgust research, and I will discuss them in the face of the pandemic, also by using some historical examples. I work in the Museum of History and Medicine now, so this is why I wanted to use that for you. So firstly, disgust activates what has been called our behavioral immune system. In sum, a defense behavioral mechanism that limits contact exposures and triggers responses of behavioral aversion and avoidance. The other interesting finding, is that disgust sensitivity has been found to be more accentuated among conservatives, a result that proved to be consistent in 121 countries beyond the US. So in 2013, a meta-analysis of 24 studies found that social and religious conservatism, but also political conservatism, can be strongly predicted by this strength. However, the COVID pandemic generates some conundrums. So events seem to suggest something different from prediction one could have done from disgust research. There have been recent studies showing that disgust sensitivity increases compliance to social distancing measures. And of course, here I am assuming that compliance with social distancing measures is an ethical behavior as it responds to an ethics of solidarity, okay? But we now see that, well, in general, people all around the world are struggling to follow the measures. And another important situation is that worldwide conservatives have expressed resistance of complying with these measures. So in most countries of Europe, for example, neglecting the governmental recommendations, people have not refrained from mass gatherings after the reopenings. And the refusal of mask wearing has become a political issue for conservative politicians everywhere. So here you see Donald Trump, but the other one is a radically right-wing politician in Italy. His name is Matteo Salvini, who refused to wear the mask at the Senate in Italy, okay? So how can we explain this? There are many ways, and of course, I mean, Ben is going to speak about conspiracy theories. There is, you might mention in-group biases, but I'd like here to focus on disgust. So let me go back to what disgust is, or what is intended to be in the research. So from Charles Darwin on, most scholars acknowledge disgust as an adaptive emotion, selected by evolution as a pathogen avoidance detector. So disgust protects from intoxication and in general infectious threats, like microscopic threats, like for example pathogens, where macroscopic threats, aggressive animals, are more elicitors of fear. So disgust has a regulative role in social groups. It generates the so-called contagion heuristics, a mental shortcut that makes people avoid contact with alleged contaminated people or objects. Elicitors of physical disgust are body liquids like feces, urine, blood, vomit, mucus, but also insects like, for example, cockroaches, bugs, spiders. So research established that disgust may come that disgust inputs may come from all five senses, but more robustly for taste and smell, that can be considered the most visceral ones, as they directly activate the brain region of disgust that is insula. So the first question I'd like to raise is, are we really disgusted by COVID-19? In other words, is COVID-19 are COVID-19 signs good disgust elicitors? Let's compare it with the epidemics of the past. So epidemics of the past were smallpox, measles, typhus, leprosy, cholera, syphilis, tuberculosis, and of course the plague, the Black Death, so-called Yersinia pestis. So these diseases showed incredibly disgusting signs. For example, buboes, grazes, purulent and foul-smelling secretions, bleeding ulcers, etc. And they led to incredibly fast infection. During the Black Death pandemic of the 14th century, people were dying 3-7 days after the early signs. So what I mean is that we know that disgust, especially incidental disgust, operates on attentional cognitive mechanisms, and it works in a very short term. So, however, we now know that high percentage of COVID-19 patients have mild symptoms or are symptomatic, and this may justify why people who have not had direct contacts with COVID-19 severe patients may not be naturally prone to engage in social distancing behavior. Also, social responses of the past based on disgust have been inadequate without proper scientific knowledge. As for the plague of the 14th century, Giovanni Boccaccio reports that there was the idea that touching or using the clothes of the sick could spread the disease. So you see, for example, also the uniform of the plague doctor in the 14th century. So please don't complain about masks today. So, however, without the idea of asymptomatic patients, people continued to make mass rituals like going to church or organizing processions. Germ theory of disease arose only in late 19th century with the birth of bacteriology, and hand washing was not a practice before Ignaz Semmelweis studies on puerperal fever in Vienna in the 1840s. So that was even accepted belatedly. So in the past, people believed that contamination was spread by polluted air. The Greek word was miasma, or in Latin, malaria, from which the disease, malaria, okay? Disgust without proper scientific knowledge, without a rationalization is not enough. So, and let's go to conservatism. So, as for the link between conservatives and disgust, this link needs a clarification, I feel. So, recent scales of disgust, like for example, the one proposed by Joshua Tiger's team, have distinguished between pathogen, sexual, and moral disgust. It has been shown that conservatives are not prone to protect themselves from bodily harm, that is pathogen disgust, but they have increased disgust reactions to sexual issues. Like, for example, they are disgusted by homosexuality, incest, and so on. So another study made with this scale proved that sensitivity to sexual disgust predicted the vote for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. Besides, recent studies conducted in Germany and the US confirmed that conservatives are not more sensitive to disgust than liberals, but each political side was positively associated with its own specific set of disgust elicitors and negatively associated with the set of the other political side. You know that liberals may be disgusted by animal experimentation, animal torture, by pollution, climate change, and so on. So they have other kinds of elicitors, and also like moral ones, like fairness, unfairness, dishonesty may disgust them. So interestingly, some recent data showed that compliance with social distancing measure in the US was dependent on two things that conservatives may show in a lesser degree: pathogen disgust and caring about others. So interestingly, in this kind of study, epistemic attitudes, like, for example, believing in pseudoscience or conspiracy theory, were unrelated to the refuse of social measures. So I think that a good question could be, should we nudge disgust? I'm proposing this question because this idea has been proposed by many governments, including the Italian ones, okay? So the idea was to sensitize the population in order to promote socially responsible behavior. I don't know if you're familiar with nudge theory, but this theory has been proposed by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And according to this theory, to nudge theory, which is a form of libertarian paternalism, they say, we should influence people's ethical behavior by triggering emotional processes, for example, by using images like that, okay? So let me say that I'm very, very skeptical about that. Disgust results not only in avoiding physically certain situations and persons, but may lead easily to discriminate and marginalize others in moral terms, okay? We call it moralization, and Ben knows it very well. With me, we made research on that. So the amplification of moral judgment. Disgust has been linked to social prejudice in many, many studies. So like homophobia, xenophobia, racism, and sexism. And we can find this attitude also historically. So people accused in the past, people accused the foreigner as being the vehicle of miasma. So, for example, the ancient Greek historian Thucydides reported the belief that the outbreak of the Athens plague in the 5th century was due to poisoning of the water reservoirs by the Spartans during the Second Peloponnesian War. And during the Black Death of the mid-14th century, people blamed Jewish communities for poisoning wells, and so it started the persecution historically. Very, very sad. So around the world, we have seen several xenophobic incidents against people of East Asian appearance. This is really, really sad, especially at the outbreak of the pandemic. And recently in Italy, there have been reported discriminatory acts against health professionals and their relatives. For example, if they have been recognized as such, they were not allowed to enter stores, their siblings could not go to school, or they were not allowed to take elevators. So what I mean, to conclude, I would be very, very cautious about proposing disgust evoking stimuli to promote socially responsible behavior, and I would focus more on scientific communication. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sergiovanni. That was awesome. Very, very, very cool. All right. So I guess it's just me now. All right. Let me get my stuff together. All right. So, I'm going to be talking about, how to think about COVID-19 conspiracy theories. So it seems like conspiracy theories have become more prevalent in recent years due to their being more easily spread through social media and things like that. Especially during the lockdown, we're spending more time at home looking at our social media. There's a lot of distrust in mainstream media. And thinking about conspiracy theories related to COVID-19, I think is especially important because what you believe in this area could have, be a matter of life and death. Though I'm glad to hear Dr. Sergiovanni's report that people who believe in such conspiracy theories are not so likely to avoid social distancing, to ignore social distancing measures and things like that. But I'd still worry about it a little bit, especially the more widespread they become. Okay. So let's start by just reviewing some of the more prevalent COVID-19 conspiracy theories. So to begin with, people believe that the recently built 5G towers have actually spread the virus themselves. People believe that Bill Gates is somehow behind the virus in order to try to mass vaccinate people for the purpose of installing microchips in them so that they can be tracked or controlled or something like that. This is sort of an updated version of this like mark of the beast evangelical conspiracy theory that has been around since like the 70s, where they think that the Antichrist is going to install microchips in people and give them barcodes that they will then be able to track and control them with. Because it says something in the book of Revelation about the Antichrist marking someone with a mark, the mark of the beast, 666, that would be necessary for them to participate in buying and selling. This is where the connection with the barcode comes in, and the idea that, oh, if we're all sort of paying for things by just waving our microchip at the sensor, then we're doing the thing that the Bible predicted. All right, anyway, that's one of them. Another conspiracy theory is that the virus originated in a Chinese lab, whether specifically to be a bioweapon or it somehow escaped the research lab. Another one is that on the other hand, that maybe the US military actually brought the virus to China as a sort of act of covert war against the Chinese. Another very prevalent conspiracy theory is that the virus doesn't really exist, that it's a hoax, or that it was the death or infection rate has been inflated as part of a plot to undermine President Trump, that somehow the Democratic Party is behind the virus hoax, and that it was just a way of getting Trump out of office. Now, that's sort of independent of thinking that maybe the virus is real and is not a hoax, and that various actors have taken advantage of it for political purposes. That's maybe something that's more likely. But in any case, these are rather popular, strangely popular conspiracy theories. So how should we think about them? And in general, how should we think about whether to take conspiracy theories seriously or not? So to start with a definition, what is a conspiracy theory? People disagree. There are more minimal and more maximal definitions. So sort of a kind of baseline definition would be something presented here by Mandic, that a conspiracy theory is an explanation of historical events in terms of the intentional states of multiple agents, the conspirators, so what they believe and desire, who, among other things, intend these historical events in question to occur, so they wanted them to happen, and they're keeping their intentions and actions secret, so it's covert. And then Cody would add that they're explanations in opposition to the official explanation of a particular event. And that seems to be part of how we think about conspiracy theories. There's an official explanation that the government or scientific authorities has presented, and then the conspiracy theorists say, oh no, that's not the real story. our theory is the real story. And then what you might also add, so this is the Wikipedia definition. They say an explanation of an event or situation that invokes a conspiracy by sinister and powerful actors, often political in motivation, when other explanations are more probable. So this definition builds in the idea that the conspiracy theory is unlikely to be true. And I don't know how helpful that is. I'd sort of leave that out for the moment so that we can, evaluate the likelihood, sort of stay neutral, and for the purposes of evaluating the likelihood that the conspiracy theories are true, rather than just assuming that because it's a conspiracy theory that it's improbable. Though the vast majority of them very well may be improbable. Okay, and also adding in the sinister intent and political motivation is important, so that, otherwise someone throwing you a surprise, your suspicion that people are throwing you a surprise party would count as a conspiracy theory if we didn't include those elements. Okay. We might also think about something that's referred to as conspiracism, whereas instead of just individual conspiracy theories, someone might have a sort of pattern of paranoid thinking about the world that we might call conspiracism, where they generally distrust official theories. And this is seems to be a growing trend that's rather troubling. I'll talk about it a little bit more later on, but that the idea that there's a breakdown in institutional trust, so that the more official an explanation is, the less likely some people are to believe it. And there's a classic version of this where just people sort of pathologically propose conspiracy theories as alternate explanations of specific events. And then there's what Pauly, in his Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, Conspiracy Theories, which if anyone wants to dig deeper into this after this talk, that's a really good place to start, thinks that there's a new conspiracism, which is bare assertion or insinuation of a conspiracy, and that aims at political delegitimation and destabilization. So there's a sort of movement towards conspiracism for the purpose of undermining governments, undermining public trust in institutions. And this is the kind of thing we get with the QAnon movement, with people like Alex Jones, who are just constantly pushing these conspiracy narratives for some kind of political aims. For the QAnon stuff, I highly recommend a podcast called QAnon Anonymous, where they get really deep into what's going on with the QAnon community. They actually sometimes attend QAnon events undercover to try and figure out what's going on with these people. All right. So the main thing I want to talk about is criteria for evaluating conspiracy theories. How can we think about how likely these things are in terms of our own judgments, and also perhaps in arguing with other people? At the end, I'll propose some suggestions for what we should do about conspiracy theories or about conspiracism in general. Okay, so to begin with, there's general theoretical virtues, how we would think about theories in general. Whether they're consistent, whether there are any contradictions within the theory, whether they're consistent with what we know to be the facts. Again, that's going to have something to do with our trust in our institutions in terms of providing us with things we might call facts. And whether so you might think of a theory as a kind of research program. So it's going to make predictions about the future, about things that we will discover. And we might evaluate a theory based on how successful those predictions are, or whether they make retrodictions. So you might notice that some of these theories backpedal on some of the specifics, and therefore we might think that they're not particularly good theories. So for instance, this whole mark of the beast thing, various evangelicals over the decades have proposed that one or another person was the Antichrist and was going to bring about this state of affairs with the microchipping and everything. And Bill Gates is just the newest iteration. So as those theories have sort of backpedaled on their original predictions, you might think that that sort of undermines their credibility, among other things that I'll get to. So next, there's issues about ontology. So for instance, the existence of the purported technology. So the idea that the 5G towers could actually spread the coronavirus depends on there existing that kind of technology, which there is no evidence for. Again, the idea that you could fit a microchip into a syringe as well. The idea that these sort of supernatural powers that the Antichrist would possess, again, seems to be questionable. Other kinds of conspiracy theories, for instance, involving George Soros's power over the political left, seems to depend on him having a kind of agency in the world that is unlikely. Conspiracy theories get their power from errant data to a large degree. So for example, with the World Trade Center conspiracy theories, people are like, well, why did building 7 fall? Data that doesn't seem to be covered by the official theory is where they get a lot of their traction. But of course, you then have to compare the errant data in the official theory to the errant data in the proposed conspiracy theory. And often, even if there are questions, doubts about the official theory, the idea that any one particular alternative theory is true is not supported just by the dubious nature of the official theory. You want to think about the motives of the supposed conspirators. Do these motives make sense? Would Bill Gates really have a good reason to infect the whole population of the world? Why would he want the kind of control that he would get from implanting microchips in them, things like that? And then compare those motives with the motives of the conspiracy theorists. So for example, conspiracy theorists who try to undermine scientific support for scientific evidence about climate change tend to be paid off by the fossil fuel industry. So you might want to think, well, what motivation does the theorist have for presenting the conspiracy theory? Then there's this issue of institutional trust. So if we think that if you want to think the coronavirus is a hoax, well, that means that a broad array of scientific, medical, and other kinds of educational institutions are all in on it, right? Are all untrustworthy, are all providing false data and things like that. And that's unlikely for one reason. Any evidence that we might have, that we might try to marshal in favor of any kind of theory, is going to depend on the credibility of our scientific institutions. So if you undermine trust in those institutions, and the conspiracy theories tend to have the effect of further undermining trust in these things, then there's no basis at all for evaluating any kind of theory anymore. And then we're just all going to be in the dark. And there's no reason to actually believe the conspiracy theories any more than the official theories. And this also brings up issues of scale, right? So very often when discussing conspiracy theories, people point out that so many people would have to be in on it and kept silent for such a long period of time that this is very unlikely that this could happen. That all the labs studying the coronavirus in the entire world, not just in the US. So if you think the point was to undermine President Trump, well, then why is the rest of the world also reporting the same kinds of results? It seems like it would be it seems impossible to have a conspiracy on such a massive scale. And so so for those reasons, I think those cover most of the theories that I mentioned at the outset, and also give us some tools for thinking about conspiracy theories in general. So what to do about conspiracism? Well, it seems like government intervention and deplatforming maybe does more harm than good, because the conspirators, the people who are saying, look, they're trying to keep us quiet, they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes, that just gives them more evidence that that's happening. If the government tries to stifle the conspiracy theories directly, ignoring it might allow it to spread unmitigated. Private engagement with theorists and followers might help, but especially in things like the QAnon community, they seem to have such a cult-like attitude that you're maybe unlikely to get much traction with them as individuals. You can spend your life doing professional investigation and trying to debunk these things, but that is going to require a huge investment of time. Educational outreach, just about science in general and about how our scientific institutions work, seems like it might be the best path forward. It turns out that people who are college educated are much less likely to believe in conspiracy theories for a variety of reasons. They tend to recognize that explanations of phenomena seem to be more complex than the conspiracy theory assumes. They build trust in public institutions, and things like that. You learn, how peer review works, and other sorts of concepts that someone who maybe is not college educated might not be privy to. All right, that's it. Thank you. And thanks to everybody. Thanks to our presenters, and to everybody who came out. Thank you to Michiko for helping us organize the event. Happy World Philosophy Day, everyone.
No, that was amazing. That was very informative.
Thanks.
That was amazing.
Happy World Philosophy Day, folks.
All right.
Well, so we don't have time for questions and answers, but let's think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm willing to hang out for a little while if anyone wants to ask a question, but I don't know about everybody else.
Okay, thank you so much. Distinguished panelists, let's give them a round of applause.
Everybody. All right.